And we'll share my screen for our brief introduction. Um, oop, not the right one. Let's see. Okay, can everyone see my presentation? Yes, amazing. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone, or good evening, or good afternoon, depending on where it is you're joining us from. Thank you so much for attending today's session. My name is Bernie Traversari, and I'm the Director of Operations and Programs for the Society for Conservation Biology North America. I am really happy to be welcoming everyone to the first of our webinar sessions that is part of our new policy series on learning the language of scientific assessments as decision-making tools. I will talk a little bit more about what the overall series is going to cover and introduce our presenters for today in a little bit. But first, I wanted to do a brief introduction of SCBNA for those of you that are not familiar with our organization. So SCBNA is a professional society dedicated to advancing the science and practice of conserving Earth's biological diversity. We envision a world with thriving biodiversity, ecosystems, and human connections, and we seek to provide an environment that welcomes, supports, and empowers diverse students and professionals to contribute, advance, and apply conservation science. And we look to do this through a variety of different means, including professional development opportunities like today's webinar, but also others focused on technical skill building and conservation education. We also have a number of research and publication options that are available to SCBNA members. And we also host a biannual conference, the next iteration of which will be taking place next year in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and will be co-hosted with the Society for Conservation for Ecological Restoration. So many ways for you to get engaged with SCBNA if you're not already familiar with the organization. I also always like to drop this QR code as part of my introduction so that if you are not yet a member of SCBNA, you're welcome to join. I will also include a link to become a member in the chat once I'm through with my brief introduction. Okay. So this policy series and this webinar session specifically is being hosted by our policy committee. So SCBNA, all of the work that we do is volunteer-based. It is also distributed amongst different standing committees, and one of those is our policy committee. And the mission of this committee in particular is to bridge the gap between conservation science and policy. And we do this through a variety of different ways. We engage with members and chapters on local policy actions. We either write or sign on to policy letters and statements of issues that are of importance to the society. And we also develop professional development resources like this series and others, which are available on our website. So the committee is always active. And it is made up of some really cool people. Our current chair is Lauren Jonitis, who's the executive director of Tropical Audubon in Florida. She is also the vice president of policy and the ESCBNA board. But as you can see, we have other members that are also part of the committee. And I always want to say, if you're interested in policy and in conservation policy specifically, please send an email to the address included in the screen here so that you can join the committee or at least learn about joining the committee. That'll allow you to take part in all the different activities that I mentioned before and also help organize webinars like today's. So please make sure to do so in addition to becoming a member of SCBNA. Okay, so before we jump into introducing our presenters for today, I just wanted to go through a couple of housekeeping items, just to make sure that everyone is familiar with how today is going to flow, and also you are familiar with the tools available through this Zoom webinar. The first thing I want to say is that if you like, you should be able to initiate closed captions or a live transcript of this presentation on your own. Unfortunately, even through a recording, those closed captions do not become available if I initiate them. So I recommend everyone to do that, select that option on your own if you want to through the main options on your screen. In addition to that, I encourage everyone to use the chat to ask questions, especially during our Q&A portion of the session. This will be easiest for me to track and then share with our speakers after their individual presentations. I will also ask that everyone toggle their on and off video as needed. We don't have a preference during presentations or during the Q&A. What we will ask is that everyone is muted during presentations so that everything can come across clearly for those in attendance. And then the last thing, as a reminder, you can use the reactions button in case you want to ask a specific question or just react to whatever the speakers are saying. This is a fun way to be more engaged and make the session interactive, but it will be particularly useful once we reach that Q&A session at the end. Okay, so about our webinar series. The idea of offering a series on scientific assessments is to raise awareness and educate the public on how these assessments come together and what is their use as policy-making tools. We've received a lot of emails and communications speaking to the interests of our membership on this subject, and so we wanted to come up with a series that covers this in some detail and that talks about assessments in a variety of different ways. So today's session will be the first in the series, but we have two more that are upcoming on October 23rd and October 28th. And then we will have a number of other sessions that will be offered next year in January through March of 2026. So be on the lookout for those as well. And if you're interested, you can already sign up for these two upcoming webinars on our website in the same manner as you did for today's webinar. Okay, so today's webinar is titled Learning Language Scientific Assessments 101. So this is, you can think of it as an introductory webinar to our overall series. And I am very excited to say that we have 5 fantastic speakers with us today to contribute to our webinar. Our first speaker is Dr. Sergio Enriquez. He is a Red List Authority Coordinator for the IUCN Species Survival Commission. We also have with us Dr. Mark Urban, who is a professor of ecology and evolutionary biology with the University of Connecticut. In addition, we also have Dr. Gillian Bowser, who is an associate professor at Colorado State University and currently a Fulbright scholar at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. We also have Dr. Brian Helmuth, who's a professor at Northeastern University and the chief scientific officer at the Proteus Ocean Group. And last but not least, we have Dr. Shai Andre Divan, who is a professor at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, who will be acting as our discussant today. And in case folks are not familiar with the role of a discussant, it is essentially to provide feedback and commentary after the presentations are done to try and tie everything back together and provide some important context for our Q&A session. So we really appreciate Dr. Divan playing that role for us today. Okay, that is it for me. I will open the floor to Sergio, and I would like to thank all of our presenters for being here today, for dedicating a few hours of their day to this session, and for contributing to our overall series.
Just a second, I will be with you briefly. Many PowerPoints to open. Here. There you go. Okay. So thank you, everyone, and thank you for the introduction. As I'm left with the impossible task of introducing the language of scientific assessments, so I'll just be happy if I fail really well, but I will try really hard. So here it is in 10 minutes or a bit more, my short outline. I'll be talking in part 1 about the NatureServe and its conservation status, about the IUCN and its red list, and then how 2 languages share one goal and the language of extinction. Very succinctly, for part 1, NatureServe has been around for about 50 years, is an authoritative source of biodiversity data in North America, so Canada and the US. It basically works with a number of network organizations to collect, analyze, and deliver biodiversity knowledge that informs, ideally, conservation action. It has the legacy of conservation, starting with the Nature Conservancy, which helps establish the first state natural heritage program. State natural heritage programs are ways for scientists, like the ones in the audience perhaps, to engage and share their data. They sometimes also have sponsored surveys where they'll support scientists to actively go and compile or collect that data. And of course, state DNRs, the Department of Natural Resources, are often the ones who use that data and will sometimes also support data collecting on undervalued groups like the ones I studied. So there are all ways to engage with NatureServe. Why should you engage with NatureServe? Well, they have what they call conservation status ranks. And in a nutshell, there are 5-point scales that go from critically imperiled, being that the most close to extinction, and secure, being the one furthest from extinction. They work in this 5-point scales, as I mentioned, but they impact global, or they assess global, national, and sub-national scales, what they call the S rank. Subnational is of interest to me particularly because subnational here means territories and states, basically. So when state decision makers want to support or understand how threatened a species is in their particular US state, the S rank is often a source of information for the NR. You can find the links to the things I'm saying and more information on the bottom right of your screen. In this case, is explorer@natureserve.org. This is how the page kind of looks like. I added the picture of the Rusty Patch. Everything else is just print screen from the page. This is the Rusty Patch page. You can see it's G2, so globally imperiled. That's the language they used. But if you look to the right, you can see that the map that you see on the left, on the right, you see the list per state how the species is doing. The map also shows that in colors, but you can see for Alabama, for example, the first one on the list is SNR, that's no status rank, no rank was assigned, and the last one, which is Wisconsin, is S1, so critically imperiled, that's the highest level of threat before extirpation or extinction. A detail I want to mention about the Rusty Patch at the bottom right of your screen is other statuses, and that's the US Endangered Species Act. The Rusty Patch bumblebee is also in the ESA, and the NatureServe will connect you to that information if available. The Endangered Species Act is interesting. They do not work necessarily with NatureServe, but they do extract information from it. The Endangered Species Act has two categories: the endangered, which means being in danger of extinction, and threatened, which is likely to become endangered in the foreseeable future. There's, of course, several differences between the two. The main which that I think is worth sharing: ESA is a federal legal framework. NatureServe is a non-profit scientific organization. They have different authorities. The number of species, the ESA has about 1,700 species in the US currently, whereas NatureServe has 100,000 species in North America. So very different remits, but the ESA has binding legal protection, whereas NatureServe is basically a repository of data that informs conservation and conservation action. You can contribute to both. I already mentioned how to contribute to NatureServe. I mentioned here NOAA, which I like, and the ESA 50th anniversary logo they designed. You can go online. This ended yesterday, sadly. The presentation just happened to be today. Yesterday, there's a proposed ruling by the Fish and Wildlife, and this was a proposal for a lizard species from Borneo to be proposed as threatened, which you now, I hope, know kind of what it means, under the Endangered Species Act. The reason why the US proposes species that are not US native is because they are traded in the US. So there is a burden of responsibility. In this case, was a proposal that anyone can submit a public comment to, and I was one of those people. You can also submit it as an organization. It's, again, another way to be involved in, proactively be involved in conservation policy. But just be mindful, this is just a little snippet of the complexity of all of this. But I'll move on to part 2, which is the IUCN and its red list. The IUCN, in a brief intro, has over 75 years of existence, is the oldest organization of its type. It is also the only organization that convenes both governments and civil society. And because it is an observer and has consultative status at United Nations, it gives it global credibility as an authority on nature conservation. The summary I like to give very, very succinctly is that IUCN has member organizations like state agencies or NGOs or indigenous groups. and it has staff, and the staff implements the decisions that the member organizations voted on. And then it has the commission, which is there are 7 commissions really, but they have an advisory role, scientific advisory role. One of such commissions is the Species Survival Commission. That's the SSC, to which I am a member, and it's a science-based network. It is actually the largest science-based network in the world. It won a Guinness World Record for that, and it focuses in what they call the conservation cycle, which is, in a nutshell, assess towards informing planning, conservation planning, towards informing conservation action, and then the cycle continues again. The most known tool is, of course, the assess component, and that is the red list of threatened species. That's the name of it. Doesn't have statuses. It has what we call categories, and that's on, you can see the categories on the chart to your left. And from those, the ones we call threatened categories are the ones to your right. And basically, we use different criteria, 5 criteria, which each of them have a quantitative threshold to assess how threatened of extinction a species is. It assesses both plants, both animals, and fungi. You can find more information and you can access the data for research or curiosity in the link I shared in the bottom right of your screen. So this is the most succinct thing I could do about the red list. It's very complex, but you can and should propose red list assessments. You can criticize the ones present, and they can be regularly updated as new information becomes available. IUCN is also the birthplace of CITES. CITES is, of course, the acronym for the Convention of International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. It does not include fungi, and in a nutshell, is an international agreement between governments. It is a checklist currently of 36,000 species. Again, the link in the bottom right, you can check all of those species, and they are placed in appendices. That's the terminology of CITES. The Appendix 1 is where the most endangered species are placed. Appendix 2, the ones where trade is regulated for. And Appendix 3 is the least thorough of the 3, is where species are protected by one country that requests other countries to share information with it about the trade in a particular species that they are concerned about it. The IUCN Red List is a big, well, because it's also at the onset of IUCN and CITES, informs CITES, but I want to be very mindful that there are a number of papers trying to analyze. This is just one. This is Sheffers from 2019. It has been quoted up to this day, up to 2025. There's about 500 quotes or something for it. So it's well cited. However, it tries to compare the gap between species that are classified as traded in the red list, but not present in CITES. What they fail to acknowledge is that an animal can be traded in the red list and named or trade is a threat, but it might happen at a national level. So a species can be traded from northern Brazil to southern Brazil or from Florida to California. That's national trade. CITES does not regulate that. So even though it is traded and IUCN Red List recognizes it, it would not appear in CITES. That's one of the reasons for the gap. There's many other reasons. Another reason is there might be trade, but it might be sustainable and not really be a threat. So CITES would not list that as well. On the other hand, several species in CITES that are in CITES are not labeled as traded in the Red List. And that's because CITES not only lists species that are traded, but it has a look-alike category. So if 2 animals or 2 orchids, for example, look extremely alike, they will both be CITES listed so that there's no laundering happening, but one of them or multiple of them might not be impacted by trade at all, so they wouldn't appear in the red list as a threat, if that makes sense. So there are several cautionary tales that I would like quickly to share about that. And so if you have a chance to not cite this article, please don't. And if you ever have questions about it, please reach out. I'll be happy to point you to whatever knowledge I can partake in the little time we have. Last part, so I'm hoping I'm doing good on time. 2 languages, 1 goal. When comparing the NatureServe ranks to the left and the categories of IUCN to the right, you can see they never overlap in language except for vulnerable. And even though vulnerable is the same word in both of them, they do not mean the same thing. Vulnerable in NatureServe actually would be closer to near threatened in the red list, and vulnerable in the red list actually is closer to imperiled in NatureServe. Those are just comparisons. You can see the literature again on the bottom of your screen to learn more, but just know that they are, you can use both, they complement each other, but they're not at all the same, and they don't talk the same language. even though they aim the same goal, which is stopping extinction. This is a paper from 2025, NatureServe to the left, Red List to the right. Just wanted to highlight, you can see how many more categories you have of NatureServe for this case, subterranean biodiversity in North America. So Red List is well regarded globally. It is lacking a lot of North American species, which is surprising to many. So you can also have a chance to contribute to Red List more species in the US and make this graph a bit more balanced. Extinction as a whole in society is seen very differently. These are just a few posters of movies that come across. The reason I have this is because first, my colleagues appreciate it. And second is because if you look at Google Trends of the word extinction, the peak is July 2014. This is not a peak of a species being announced as extinct or a zoo. This is the movie on your top left. When the movie came out, that's when the word spiked. So in pop culture, extinction has gained this different meaning, usually extinction of the species or human species, or talking about dinosaurs. So it took on a life of its own, but that's of course media for you. I'm not going to talk about it, but I will say people have misused or appropriated the term extinction for someone else. This is in London, where I used to live, and Save London from Affordable Homes from Extinction is a clear comparison with affordable homes with the panda, which is of course vulnerable in Red List, or at least is listed as in risk of extinction. So this is not an accident. They're trying to use a word that used to be scientific driven to be used for the home market. They also mention rare and rarer. Rarity is a whole different topic. We could do 30 minutes just on rarity. This is a book on rarity. It's not the right book to read on rarity. I would recommend reading this from Gaston, which talks about the 7 types of rarity and how they may or may not be connected to extinction risk. Different thing altogether. So I'll move on to the last one. Often in the news, because they're portrayed by journalists, they will say that a species once extinct is now reproducing. This, of course, would not be possible. A species that is extinct cannot be bred. What they mean is extirpated. The animal was extirpated, was gone from a region, and is now fortunately back. So this is a good news, just not correctly communicated, I would argue. And the comments on this article are funny because they commented on exactly that, if you want to look it up. Different kind of issue is when people use extinction in a different way. And this case is the de-extinction debate, which I'll not go into for many good reasons, but you can, of course, judge for yourself. It is important to say that a species cannot be de-extinct. This is not what this is. This is an animal that resembles an extinct animal. Its phenotype was changed to resemble a dire wolf. It is not a dire wolf, and it cannot or should not be released for a number of reasons. Different topic, but just to say, the word extinction has been used very loosely and often not accurately at all. Sometimes purposely, sometimes by accident. I would argue the extinction was used wrongly on purpose. Again, my personal opinion. Another way to see extinction, one of the most common perhaps, or very common in science, is saying like 99.9% of all species that ever lived are extinct. This is correct, but it does not deter from the extinction we're going today. When we talk about this number, the 99.9, we talk about these extinctions, so mass extinctions events. Species have gone extinct in the past. This is just a chart of the mass extinctions we have so far recorded. But also, I should say, all the species that survived mass extinctions, they're also extinct today. They survived, but they evolved. So of course, we lost all of these. We are not concerned, it's a great matter of study, but it's not a human concern that species have gone extinct in the past. That number means very little in the context, or trying to argue for we shouldn't care about conservation because 99 were lost, what's wrong with a few more? What we're talking here is human-driven extinction. So just to summarize and as an end, this is the language of extinction. Mass extinction means that there's a significant rise, usually about 75% of extinction rates above what we consider the normal background level. That's what we mean by that. And sadly, we fear that is where we are today. That human-driven extinctions, the ones we should be considered about, the ones I'm inviting you to participate in policy about, are human-driven extinctions, which are considered to be 1,000 times the estimated background extinction rate, and up to 10,000 times if the threatened species in the IUCN, a language I hope you now understand a bit better, if those threatened species do become extinct, that rate would be 10,000 times faster. Lastly, I just want to present a chart. One of the concerns we have is climate change. I think it introduces the next presentation well by my colleague Mark Urban. And this is from his paper. And it shows that even if we meet, let's say, the pre-industrial temperature rise of 2 degrees, many species, those little blue balls on your screen on the bottom right, are feared to go extinct. And as, of course, as we meet these targets, the higher that target is not met. Let's say the higher the temperature, the more extinction, sadly, we expect, even though it's not linear, as my colleague might say, and the graphic presents. In a nutshell, very, very quickly, this was my failed attempt at explaining the language of extinction. Thank you all. That's my institutional email if you want to reach out, and I will stop sharing my screen now. Thank you all.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Sergio. Mark, I believe you are up.
Yes. Can you see the correct screen there? Is that right?
We're seeing presenter
We're
mode.
still, yes.
Try this again. This one now? All right, great. Okay, so yeah, I'll be building off of Sergio's talk, and he set me up really well by presenting the graph of extinction risk from climate change. And the idea here is I want to talk a bit about how does science interact with assessments, and also what are the biases that we face when trying to assess things like extinction risk. And this slide, opening slide, is just to suggest that I'm really a field biologist, and so really coming from the standpoint of how can I, working in the field, contribute to global or national or subnational knowledge on these aspects. So yeah, is this slide moving forward? There we go. So yeah, when we think about policy, we can think about both international policy, like the Convention on Biological Diversity, or as Sergio talked about, Endangered Species Act. And what feeds into that policy are these assessments, and they can be at various levels as well. And so people are familiar probably with the climate change reports through the IPCC. Also, biodiversity now has its own assessment organization, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Sciences. And of course, the National Nature Assessment was America's attempt to do a similar type of assessment that, of course, was recently canceled, but will go on as a nonprofit effort. And so the policy interacts with those assessments in terms of that those assessments suggest what are global or national status of trends in biodiversity, and then what might need to be done in terms of policy to protect them. But the point I want to make here is that scientists of all types can contribute to these assessments. And so one of the things I didn't appreciate before I started to get involved in these assessments was the degree to which they really just depend on what research has been done. And so the assessments generally cannot generate new knowledge. So they're not in the business of creating new types of analyses. Maybe they can put some points together, but they're really not supposed to do any sort of new research. They're just supposed to synthesize what's out there with the understanding that is been peer reviewed, and that is something that can be used in the assessment. So I didn't really ever appreciate that, but they're the synthesis arm, not the doing arm of this whole process. And so there's really an important role for scientists to provide that type of information that is needed for those assessments. And I'm not very good at this, but there's lots of people out there who think about this a lot more, and will actually think about the next reports coming out from the IPCC or IPBES or a national assessment, and will do the research, a year or two in advance, and get it published so that it can be a part of that assessment. So they're really trying to feed into that process really in a direct way. So one of the things that I did to contribute to these assessments is what Sergio showed, but this was a new version of it because I saw the assessment from the IPCC and I was not satisfied with what they did with my previous work, and so I decided that I wanted to contribute and to provide an updated version of it. And so this updated version is where I looked at over 400 different studies that looked at extinction risk from climate change. And they made about 5 million predictions overall, different kinds of assumptions for each of those predictions in each of those studies, and has a much more global representation from the previous one. And this is just the updated graph from what Sergio showed. And again, you see that acceleration of extinction risk with the overall global rise in temperature. And this is something that I'm trying to make essentially assessment and policy relevant so that it'll be useful in the next versions of those reports. And so uh, each of those vertical horizontal lines are different kinds of scenarios, whether we control our greenhouse emissions to 1.5 or 2 degrees, like in the blue, or if we allow it to increase up to the highest levels, such as 5 degrees Celsius, and then we see that acceleration up to about 30% extinction risk. So quite high. And this is all based on my analysis of lots of different studies and pulling them all together in a statistically defensible way. So one of the things that we find is that it's consistent with the past pattern. And at first as a scientist, I thought, oh no, like it's the same thing. I'm not, it's going to be hard to publish, but then I realized that this is really important for assessment, is to be able to show consistency and a decrease in uncertainty for policies to be made. And again, trying to make this policy relevant, one of the things I did was to show, just like the IPCC does, the effects through time. And so this is predicted extinction risk, not temperature, but according to those different scenarios that are used in the IPCC report. So they're really trying to make this as easy to pick up and use as possible. And I even went in and took the hues of the colors that were in the past IPCC report to make that connection. Just show you that when we think about these reports, there's always a bias involved. And so this is just showing the different risks across different latitudinal zones and continents. And we see that there's this higher risk in South America and Australia. But one of the things I wanted to point out is that the first numbers here is hard to see, I know, but are the number of studies that are done in each of these different geographic regions. And so, for example, the Arctic North America region, there's only 12 studies. 22 studies in Central America, 30 studies in the ocean, and of course in northern Asia there were no studies. So there are and Antarctica as well. I should point out. So there's big gaps in terms of geography in these sorts of analyses, and that's just based on what's been done, right? This showing you the differential risk among different taxonomic groups, so with amphibians having the highest risk of extinction from climate change and birds having the lowest risk. But again, highlighting that we know much less about invertebrates, 21 studies. The second number is how many different iterations of those analyses are done. Fish, 24, so quite limited. Also ecosystems, so mountains, islands, and freshwater at higher risk of climate change extinctions, but again, marine is relatively limited. So Brian will talk a bit about the marine world, I believe, and help us understand that. So the other term I want to introduce in terms of language is something called dark biodiversity, and that's the idea that we really don't have a great handle on a lot of the biodiversity on Earth, and even the things that we think we know, we don't know. So what do you mean by dark biodiversity here is an example of that is that we understand that there's about 400,000 plant species, and we were sure that we're going to identify some more of those, but that's something that we have a little bit more of a handle on than, say, a lot of invertebrate species. But out of those, we can cut out that there's really only 300,000 with any real data. And so basically that we know that species exist, but we don't know anything about them. And then we can cut out another 200,000 of those that do have some data, because there's just so few data points. And so if you're thinking about trying to make a projection about climate change, you need to know where the range of the species is and what it experiences. And if you don't know where it, it's very hard to determine where it lives with only 5 or 10 occurrence levels. So we're looking at a very a small percentage of people of species that we know anything about, enough to make these assessments, and that means that they're missed in the assessments, right? Also, another example are that we have about 160,000 different species that have been named. And if you use the Barcode of Life, recent estimate that they've done, so they're using genetic analyses to detect species, and suggestion is there's at least 2 times more than that. So about half those different species are not known to science at this point. So a lot of dark biodiversity out there. So the other thing that I did in my report was to look at observed extinctions, and this builds directly off of Sergio's work and talk about IUCN, because many of these were found through the IUCN Red List, and they do note true extinctions and extinctions in the wild. And so shown here is that just as temperatures have rose in the bottom graph there, we see all the total extinctions in the purple and orange in that middle graph. And the orange ones are ones that have been determined by IUCN and other scientific reports to be at least attributed in part to climate change. And so one of the things we see is that the proportion of species that are become extinct are increasing through time as climate change also increases. And so so we do face that issue. One of the things that is really noticeable when you try to look at all the extinctions that have been attributed to climate change is that 50% of those are recorded from the U.S. And so we're pretty certain that is that there's many more extinctions that occurred throughout the world, but there's just not enough data or the ability to report on those extinctions that we have in places like the U.S. And so again, underreported that's happening in these sorts of assessments. So and when we try to understand these trends in biodiversity more generally across the world and think about climate change impacts, we really want to have data sets that can help us to understand this. And so a group of us were trying to find good data sets that had both a spatial and temporal component, so we could think about both range responses to climate change and also changes through time, and really only found like 4 good data sets that could do that for us that met our criteria. So birds in the US, and there's some European stream invertebrate data, some Northern Europe plant data is pretty good, and Australian animal data. And but that was it really. And so everything else is either a snapshot in time or collected at a single site. And so we really have this L shape in terms of the data that's out there, but we really want to have something that's both spatial and temporal, and so that makes it much more difficult to really be able to make these predictions and test the predictions over time. So just to conclude, so assessments really heavily depend on research that's relevant to those assessments. So as much as we can design work that can help those assessments and understand what they need is important. But all of this research is, of course, biased by what data is available. Many different biases, such as geographic and taxonomic and others that I haven't gotten a chance to talk about. But I think the important point here is the biases are especially strong for the rare species. So thinking about those plants that have no data, or the different species that haven't even been named, those rare species are also often very vulnerable because they have small ranges already, or already threatened by other types of disturbances. And so this whole bottom of the iceberg is that we're not seeing of the dark biodiversity could be really important in understanding those risks. And you could try to model some of that away, and there's lots of efforts to do that, and really sophisticated techniques. But in the end of the day, if you don't have data, you don't have data. So we always need more data. Hopefully, we're seeing citizen science that's increasing that can fill some of those gaps, but we also need a more concerted effort to collect the data that's going to be important for the science that's going to inform those assessments and that policy in the end. So always calling for more data for people to be out in the field and collecting that relevant data. And with that, I'll end.
Thank you so much, Mark. Jillian, I believe it's your turn.
Okay, so this is actually a perfect follow-up, because I'm going to talk about the bias of the bias, or the bias of the data. Or I spent a lot of time talking about bugs. So hopefully everybody can see my screen correctly. So I thought my talk, and it follows Mark's really nicely about, what's all the buzz? And in part of it, what I was trying to look at is, and I love the term dark data or dark biodiversity, except for insects really like, or some insects like the light. And I know Sergio would argue that we know very little about nocturnal bugs, so that there's a lot of dark biodiversity there. But I want to talk talk a bit more about this issue of data and what data we know and what data we don't know. And like Mark, I'm a field ecologist. So I wanted to sort of show a little bit on why this can occur and why this really impacts the models that can occur. So I'm doing the same problem as Mark. Not there we go. So what's all the buzz about? And I think what we hear about with species and sort of give the punchline first is people perceive and then people record what they see and what they value. So when we talk about pollinators, we get a lot of information or excitement about finding out what pollinators are doing and where do they appear in assessments, and then what a local population do about them. You know, are they decreasing? Are they increasing? Are they doing okay in cities? Are they declining in agricultural fields? So this is a lot of questions about pollinators, and not because people have gained an interest to what pollinators may or may not be doing. So I wanted to sort of think about two pieces and bring that back together. So if you start with like the larger assessments, and the assessments are meant to inform policymakers with policy relevant information. So we look at ecosystem services, some of your policy relevant information is that intact ecosystems tend to remove carbon, for example, but they're challenged by land use, land cover change, activities, land degradation, etc. So when you say, how are pollinators doing, you assume that these activities are impacting these organisms and thus they are declining, they're in peril, or they're in danger of going extinct, you know, and using sort of public wording there, not necessarily the thing. But the problem we run into is that intactness, as Mark showed, implies that you know what's there and that you know what you know fairly evenly distributed across their either role in the ecosystem or what they're doing, what they're not doing. And this is a big problem, I think, for assessments to come up with a solution or an action plan. So why is this language so tricky? As Mark said, and Sergio said, scientific assessments are not research. They're based on scientific literature, but they often, you know, especially the larger international assessments, IPCC, IPBES, the GEO, Global Environmental Outlook reports, etc., all rely on scientific knowledge, federal and government knowledge, but they also include local knowledge, different types of knowledge systems, and more, this is the case on local knowledge. And as Mark mentioned, things like citizen science knowledge are now starting to come in, and museum data as ways to find out about what is the status, trends, and projections of things in our environment and what influences those numbers. So they provide this relevant data, and we tend to, I love this comic, this is actually from the Climate Change Convention, COP27 in Glasgow, Scotland. It's like, wow, the Atlas of Doom, everything's falling apart, everything's going to extinction, biodiversity loss was the word of the day. But we need to ask ourselves, what do we know and what do we not know? And with a focus on insects to make an informed decision, we are greatly informed by what we see or what we don't see. And I'm using the term seed. I mean, what people pay attention to and what they don't pay attention to. And there's some things they simply do not see. And that gets to Mark's point again. We don't have the data for the modeling, so the assessment can't provide the accurate data information that is relevant for policymakers to make a decision. So here's some of these ideas that we played with in the natural nature assessment that all the speakers on this call were involved with, as Mark mentioned before it demised. And we were trying to think about what is the role of perceptions, what people see, in our ability to project a future by what happens with what we miss, what do we not see, and what are the interactions of what we know and what we don't know. And this issue of what people see is sort of more on the social science side, but for the insect world, it does get into, and sorry to quote you, Mark, you know, we tend to see a lot of pretty things, and we don't see a lot of not pretty things. So we will get good data on pretty stuff, and then we will not get data on other things. And this attenuates itself. So the dark biodiversity actually may be growing rather than shrinking because people are looking for things and not looking for other things and simply not seeing them. So they don't appear in the assessment literature. So here's an example that actually Brian, who's the next speaker, and you know, I worked on with the National Climate Assessment on the ecosystem chapter. And the language in the assessment is about biodiversity loss and change, or biodiversity shifts. And what we were trying to highlight is that in terms of a policymaker, you have to be careful about this issue of loss or dark data or lack of data, or where species are simply not being detected for whatever reason, because you could have species shifts going on. So if you're in community A and all the species are shifting to community B, you have different results than if you're in community A and all the species have simply vanished from community A. So it's understanding where things are moving, and they're not all doing it the same way. And this is a graphic from Chapter 8 of the National Climate Assessment showing that bees, just in the pollinator world, bees and butterflies are doing different things. And because they're doing different things, some are shifting up, some are shifting down, some are using agriculture, some are not. It's hard to get a pattern to say, are things moving or declining? And so again, as we highlighted, where things get missed, or they can be misidentified, or they could simply be in pockets. And if you haven't happened to walk through that pocket, you don't see them. So, one example that Sergey is aware of, this summer we walked off the beaten path in Yellowstone National Park and discovered an entire colony of the western bumblebee, Bombus occidentalis, which is considered to be eligible for listing as endangered, but it also looks a lot like another species. So there's this issue of misidentification as well as simply missing it because no one happened to walk in that section of the park and look for bees. So, but here's a problem with observations, and this is where the other type of bias I want to talk about, the second part of this is what do we see? And then what happens with the data that we see? And this is some work that Sergio did to look at, okay, let's look at the data. What do people report? What do people see out there in the world? And then what do we do with that data? Because this data is getting larger and larger. So this is data on the bees. And this is from the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And you can see that the most common bee out there that is identified in citizen science data sets or participatory data sets is the bumblebee. And arguably it's because bumblebees are pretty, but they're also relatively easy to decline. But take a look at this map on the top corner, and then I'm going to go to the next slide. But here's the problem. So these are what we did is we chose, or actually Sergio did this work, 4 different groups that were of interest to us in the National Nature Assessment and said, okay, where do these occur? And what patterns may be emerging from where people see species, and then what does the impact on the assessment, or remember, we're going for policy relevant information based on where we see these organisms and what do we do about it. So we have 2 plants in here, and it's not so important to see which plants are where, but one of the plants on the far right is actually fairly common. What we simply looked at was take a bunch of species, and actually most of these are butterflies, and say, where do they occur? And you get a lovely map of the cities of North America. If you look at the dark blobs, most of those are cities. And so you get a lot of data that gives you species occurrence, but doesn't give you accurate distribution information of the data. So public is seeing species, they're providing species, but it doesn't help us see if they're moving latitudinally, longitudinally, up, down, or if they're common throughout their range. But what I think is interesting about this is that one of the conservation mantras is that we don't know a lot about urban areas. And you could almost argue with GBIF data, we probably know too much about urban areas. And I'll show you a little bit more what that looks like. So this is the issue of perceptions. Perceptions can become a data trap. We think we have good data. We think we can make a model of that assessment, but are we really just recording pretty species and failing to record common species? And in the case of the blue butterfly, which is a tiny little species, but very common across the United States, it's not necessarily recorded that well, but now there's indication that this might be one group that's increasing rather than decreasing, where many of the other butterflies are decreasing. It's small, Mark shaking his head, that was in Otto's paper, but it's one of these species that's interesting because it's also hard to identify. And one of the things that you do is you can take a picture of a lovely blue butterfly in iNaturalist and pop it on the map, but it doesn't really give us good assessment data as to what that population is or is not doing. So I think the issue of pollinators and assessments and the assessments of small things is something to discuss and learn about as we move into the next assessment, to think about how we use species occurrence data And these are some articles that were in Science recently, looking at butterfly data and also some bee data, and asking, what do we not know? And do we know what we don't know? And then what do we do with that data in terms of assessing for the future? If we're missing most of the pollinator species, or a good chunk of them, do we know whether pollinators are declined or not? So I just want to close very quickly, and just make sure I do a shout out to all the fabulous students who spent a lot of time in the field collecting a lot of bees and bumblebees. That perceptions and data abundance do not necessarily lead us to good assessment information, but it leads us to lovely challenges. And I think Mark or Brian will talk next about this issue of how bias is important to understand in data, especially when we get into the marine world. But so as we sample backyards or fields or set up with our little mobile phones, we get a lot of data. There are over 333 million records of insects just for North America. But what does it tell us? And understanding how to assess that data and thinking about the public's perception influences that data, but what do we do to make it into a management action? So here are a couple of just last slides to show why this occurs. This is actually a map of observational coverage. And this was a wonderful talk done by Cornell University Robotics Lab at the Ecological Society of America this summer. And one of the nice thing I love about this map is that one is actually people. The one in color is the demographics of people by county, and the other one is observations of different species from GBIF data. And again, you see a remarkable similarity between these two maps, that you can actually map where people are based on what species you're seeing, which has absolutely nothing to do with the habitat of those species, but simply of where people perceive things. So what's all the buzz? Nature data assessments are full of gaps, and those gaps can be traps, because small things can be absent and pretty things can be overrepresented. Like think of the Bombas example. But when we look at what are the benefits of a lot of data on little known things, is do we think about assessments also as a way to engage the public and stakeholders using whatever information is available? And people like Mark have the challenge of trying to figure out how to model this messy data. But that engagement is an important part of the assessment process, that you get people thinking about organisms like pollinators for the first time and actually taking pictures of them, marking them, tagging them, and seeing how that knowledge can then be used to come up with a management decision and assessment framework. So I think one of my last slides, and I love this one, this is from iNaturalist, of the 133 million or whatever number of species observations it is. And I just love that one of the common most observed animal planet of the 50 states, one of them is a bumblebee that shows up in many places. And why? Because it's pretty. And if I keep working hard on this, I'll get even the marine biologist, Brian, to appreciate a bumblebee or two, but I'm working on him. He's working on the bass side. But it's just important to see that people see things and then they report things. And maybe our assessments need to approach where the public is as a knowledge system to provide policy relevant data based on where the scientific literature may be. So last thing to just throw out there is make sure we don't forget about technology. Technology is changing how fast we can identify taxonomy. We heard about DNA work, but also just simply AI. And the ability to identify species is sort of staggering, and how fast it can do that. And so this is also creating this problem of people now can see things and get a species information just by taking a picture. And now this data set is growing and growing and growing. And we need to figure out how to assess it so we can use this data because it maintains the public's interest. And that's an important piece. So my last slide is to say, people protect what they understand. And technology and AI influences taxonomic accuracy, and it needs to be part of our assessment process because it's the engagement of the people. And what we want is policy relevant information that gives us status trends and future projections that local communities and local knowledge keepers, whether they're indigenous, local, urban, wherever, can use for the protection of a species or a group from extinction. And I believe that is my last slide. Yep, and I turn the floor over now to my marine colleague as the next speaker.
And I just realized I'm muted. Can everybody see the slides okay? All right, great. So I want to continue this discussion of bias in what we measure based on what we care about, and take you underwater to do that. I've had a rather bizarre career. I'm a marine biologist, but I became very frustrated with the lack of uptake of scientific information. So I moved into public policy and now have a joint appointment in a School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs. And then recently, in the last 5 years, started collaborating really heavily with cognitive psychologists to understand how people perceive nature, and specifically the ocean, because it influences all these things that you just heard Sergio and Mark and Gillian talk about. So if I show you a picture like this of a clownfish, I'm guessing everybody's seen this. Everybody's seen Finding Nemo, knows what this is. If I show you this picture, everybody's going to recognize this is a great white shark. Maybe less so, but if I told you that it's cod, everybody's going to at least recognize what it is. What if I showed you this? I'd bet good money that almost nobody on this call has any idea what this is. Let me introduce you to the bristlemouth. The bristlemouth is not only the most common fish in the ocean, it's the most plentiful vertebrate on the planet Earth. It's smaller than a finger. The estimates are that there are hundreds of trillions or quadrillions of them in the ocean. There are approximately 12 of these for every square meter of ocean surface. They live at depths of about 100 to 800 meters, but we know almost nothing about them. And even most marine biologists like myself, I've never seen one of these things in the wild, yet it's the most common vertebrate on the planet. That's really in contrast to what we think about when we talk about the ocean. So when I go and do surveys and ask people about marine ecosystems, to draw a picture of the marine ecosystem, just as you heard from Mark and Gillian, most often we will get things that are pretty. We'll get things that are represented in cartoons, things like clown anemone fish. Things that are cute, especially things that have very big eyes. I mean, I'm guessing somebody in the background is going, "Oh," right now with the baby seal. Things that are awe-inspiring, things that are huge like whales. Also things that we care about because we eat them. We spend a lot of time and effort on commercially important species like cod because they're so commercially important, or tuna. And also species that we fear. I mean, the rate of shark attacks is incredibly low, but think about all the news media. I mean, here I'm based in Boston, and we had some unfortunate shark attacks on Cape Cod, which were horrific. But in terms of your risk of getting bitten by a shark versus being in a car accident, it's really, really low. But we spend a lot of time thinking about it. And then finally, there are species that perhaps remind us of ourselves, that we anthropomorphize, things like dolphins that play. But really, is this what is important? If we think about the role of the ocean in our daily lives, every breath you take, 50% of the oxygen is made by these creatures, by phytoplankton. These are some of the most vulnerable to ocean acidification and climate change. They're at the bottom of the food web. They're literally making the oxygen. They literally made aerobic life on this planet possible. But we're still discovering new species of plankton, phytoplankton, every single day. And so what we talk about in assessments, what we focus on, even as scientists, to a large degree depend on what we think is important. And so from a psychological viewpoint, that comes down to what we think of as human nature connectedness. It's a much discussed idea that still has some vagueness in it, but you could think of it as kind of in a person's identification or bond with the non-human world. It's the extent to which people include nature as part of their identity. It can be part of their spirituality. And there's a related concept called human exceptionalism, which describes people who feel that human beings are separate from nature, that they're above nature. But the reverse of that human nature connectedness is the degree to which humans see themselves as part of nature. This is embedded in many indigenous cultures, but perhaps has been lost in a lot of our Western society. We do know that humans who show greater human nature connectedness show more pro-environmental behaviors. They're more likely, for example, to donate to conservation causes. Part of this is, especially with the ocean, is due what we call psychological distance, where there's physical distance between us and the deep sea. So it's understandable that we don't know about bristle mouths, but there's also psychological distance. So oftentimes when we think of the ocean, even when we're doing things like surfing or fishing or boating, we're only seeing the surface of the ocean. I mean, we're not seeing the bottom of the ocean. We're thinking of it as something distant that maybe we go and visit, maybe we'll scuba dive, maybe we'll go boating, but it's othering. It's othering of the ocean so that people feel removed from it rather than part of it. Again, this is in really contrast to many other cultures, for example, Polynesian cultures that consider the ocean to have personhood. So it's this false sense that what happens to the ocean, that happens in nature, doesn't impact humans. We do know that spending time in nature can reduce psychological distance. And conversely, this idea of human exceptionalism makes us feel more separate from it. So this othering of nature, this human exceptionalism, is what I've spent a lot of time thinking about with my colleague at Northeastern, John Coley. And it comes down to what we call mental models, these conceptions of how humans perceive nature and their role in it, including the mental models of scientists. So one manifestation of that is, if you've ever heard the term coupled human natural systems, or we move to this idea of socio-ecological systems, it's a feedback loop between what happens to people impacts nature, and what happens in nature impacts humans. And that's a huge step forward in even environmental science, where you think about the original work of people like Rachel Carson and Aldo Leopold. We largely focused on how humans impact nature, on all the bad things that the humans are doing in the natural world. And it's only in the last maybe 10 or 15 years that we started thinking about that reciprocal feedback loop, about what we do to nature turns around and kicks us in the pants in return. And we're shifting even farther from that to more of a concept of a coupled system where humans are part of nature. But we still see those asymmetries. So this is a result of a study that John and I did with colleagues in the Boston area, where we surveyed people about a local river. We presented them with narrative stories about the impacts of people on the river and the river on people, and ask them to describe what those were. And what you'll notice is that there's this asymmetry between people impacting the river and river impacting the people. They're both pretty high, but more people recognize that humans impact the river than they did recognizing that what happens to the river impacts people. We then ask them a series of questions about the willingness to volunteer time, to donate money, to have federal and state tax dollars donated towards environmental restoration. And there was a strong correlation between the level of exceptionalism, the level of that asymmetry, and their willingness to enact pro-environmental strategies. And so the real downstream consequences, understanding how people perceive nature. So it's really worrying to somebody like myself as a marine biologist, that when we survey even our students, this is from different majors at Northeastern University, that there's a really big decline in connectedness to the marine environment. And this is something that's reflected in Mark's 2024 science paper as well, is that we really recognize and pay attention to the marine world less than we do to the terrestrial world, because we're psychologically distant from it. So rather than kind of ending on that dim finding, what I want to finish with is what I hope is a hopeful way forward. One of the other strange parts of my career is that as a marine biologist, like so many of us, I grew up adoring Jacques Cousteau, and it kills me that when I ask my students, and especially high school students, they've never heard of Jacques Cousteau. But when I was young, he was one of the most influential people on the planet. I grew up landlocked upstate New York, sticking my face in streams and ponds and pretending I was in the ocean, largely because I was watching the movies and the TV series of Jacques Cousteau. Well, I've had the opportunity now. I work with Jacques' grandson, his oldest grandson, Fabian, who's also an ocean explorer. And we're building what we're calling the International Space Station of the Ocean, which is called Proteus. One of the things that Jacques Cousteau talked about that I just was enamored with is this idea of living on the seafloor, of being part of the ecosystem. And I've gotten to do that. Until recently, there was one civilian underwater facility for what we call saturation diving, where we literally live on the bottom of the seafloor for periods of 10 days at a time, and then conduct science and connect with the rest of the world. That's unfortunately no longer functional. But I've gotten to do it a couple times, and one of the studies that one of our students, Chrissy Kilgallen, just completed and is coming out in print, is looking at this idea that like going to space, where if you've ever heard of the overview effect, where astronauts who spend time in space come back with a new appreciation for the role of nature in human well-being. They see the lack of borders across the planet, and they see the connectedness. We did a survey of people who have lived underwater and asked whether there's essentially what we're calling an underview effect. And we found out that there really is this cognitive shift in your connection to the ocean after having lived under the water. The question that we have now is, can we harness that connectivity by sharing it with the rest of the world, and try to bring people along on that journey with us? Can we enact what we're thinking of as kind of a new deal or a new handshake with the ocean, where rather than thinking of it as something separate, we can adopt more of a worldview akin to, for example, a Polynesian culture that thinks of it as a person, as a part of our lives, that even if we're living in the center of the country, if we're living in Iowa, we recognize that half of the air we're breathing, half of the oxygen we're breathing is from the ocean, and that we had better figure out a new way to connect with it. And in doing so, kind of reinvigorate how we do our science to better inform these assessments. And I'm past my 10-minute mark, so I'm going to stop right there.
It was fantastic. Thank you so much, Brian. And thank you to all of our speakers for your presentations. At this time, I would like to invite Shai, Dr. Devon, to provide some commentary and feedback to all of our presentations, seek to tie it all together, if you will. And I will also ask our attendees to prep some questions. After the feedback is shared, we'll open the floor to general Q&A. So now is a good time to prepare those questions. Share them in the chat if you want to. Otherwise, once the Q&A comes along, you are more than welcome to unmute yourselves and share your questions live with our speakers.
Okay, can you hear me? Excellent. Thank you for this stimulating presentation, and let's see if I interpreted my role here as discussant correctly. For me, these 4 presentations, they remind us all that assessments are not only technical tools, but they're also discursive acts. They construct meaning, they define what counts as knowledge, and ultimately they shape how decisions are justified. And I think that the title of this webinar, Learning the Language, is fitting because every assessment, whether about ocean health or pollinators or species status, is written in a particular language, one that includes assumptions and metaphors and hierarchies that ultimately also influence how we see the world. From a discursive analytic perspective, assessments are not neutral measures of reality, as we've heard also from our presenters here. They are language-based instruments, and that are there to perform a certain work. And the categories and scales, descriptions that they employ, such as threatened or resilient, endangered, vulnerable, healthy, they don't simply describe nature. They organize it as well. They rank it, and they make certain kinds of actions possible, while other actions are rendered less possible or less visible or less legitimate even. In this sense, I think that scientific assessments do not just inform decision, they also frame the very space of decision-making. Brian's talk, which brings in also cognitive psychology, it highlights how the ocean and some species that live in the ocean are often othered, as he says, how they are treated as separate from human life, sometimes because of how they look, sometimes because we fear them, sometimes because we don't eat them. This is a cognitive and geographic gap, but it also translates into a discursive gap, which is anchored in what he calls human exceptionalism, and it translates into how you read then assessments or what is written in assessments. How we speak about, I think, the ocean and species in the ocean the ocean is vast, as alien, the species, maybe some species as alien, mysterious even, threatening. It reflects and it also reproduces a certain imaginative distance from the ocean. A discourse analysis lens would then invite us all to ask what metaphors dominate the public and scientific talk about the ocean. How does language of observation, monitoring, or living with the ocean may reshape this relationship? And perhaps how might we use alternative vocabularies of belonging, cohabitation, or kinship? Maybe how these will open new forms of stewardship. And Brian's mention of Proteos, this project, as a site where humans live as part of the ocean ecosystem, is fascinating because it performs a linguistic and a conceptual shift from separation to coexistence to show that rethinking our relationship with the ocean, it starts quite literally with being there, with learning to speak differently about it, and to show that or to feel that we are not afraid of it. We are part of it. It's not another. I think that the presentation by Sergio brings this discussion into the heart of assessment frameworks, the NatureServe, the IUCN, the Red List, the Endangered Species Act, and some others I think that he mentioned there. Each framework speaks its own language. Each has a specialized lexicon that translates ecological complexity, if you want to call it that, into categories that we can act upon. But I think the translation always involves some loss, some simplification, and some power. And maybe this is what as scientists we when we look at these assessments, that's maybe what Mark feels, that they are misusing or not really using the data the way they should. They move from complex data to accessible categories. And that also raises a number of questions. What are the nuances that are lost in this translation? Whose language of value becomes dominant in this assessment? The local, the scientific, the bureaucratic, or global, national, subnational? And then how these linguistic choices that we make shape the policies and also the priorities that follow these policies. Like how terms like extinction or critically impaired or vulnerable, secure, terms like red list, the colors that is used as a metaphor, or threatened, what do they do? What emotions and understandings do these terms evoke, and how do these influence then policymakers or the readers of these assessments? And again, from a discourse analysis approach, we would look at how authority is constructed linguistically through these numbers, categories, and standardized terminologies that sound objective, but are embedded in social and psychological and political contexts. I think that Gillian then goes into that with What's All the Buzz presentation. It extends on this reflection into the realm of data, of perception, of scales, and she asks a crucial question: what do we see, and how do we fail to see, and what do we fail to see in our assessments of nature? What data we know, and what data we don't know? And she gives them examples of these pollinator data traps and observation biases in all kinds of data sets, such as the Global Biodiversity Information Facility and iNaturalist. And these illustrate our language and visibility intertwine. Terms like intactness, I think you use, Gillian, data poor, bias. These terms, they carry some sort of epistemological weight. They define what counts as reliable, what counts as valid or even valuable data. And her presentation reminds us that even data is discursively constructed. People record what they perceive as important, what they perceive as beautiful, often the pretty species, and then the result is that absence of data becomes data of absence. Once again, a discursive lens, it helps us see that this is not just a problem of sampling, but also a problem of language and perception. How societal narrative and linguistic framing shape what is measured, what is known, and then what is ultimately protected. Mark's presentation and his science article, which I also read, and I'm not a natural scientist, so I read it probably differently. For me, it's more difficult to understand some of the terminology. But what I like that it provides another angle, the formalized language of scientific authority. And assessments do not generate new knowledge, as he says. The assessment depend on research, and research is often biased. And assessments are supposed to synthesize this type of research. So the language they use translates scientific language into something. And there are some critical decisions that are made about what to include, how to include, which language to use, and how to make it understandable to an audience. And as he says in his article, terms like extinction depth or representative concentration pathways, species specific dispersal, they translate uncertainty into statistical form. And then when we read that 1 in 6 species face extinction under current policies, or a term like dark biodiversity, LENTER, what we encounter here is phrases that are both empirically grounded, because we saw the research, we saw the explanation, and then they become also rhetorically powerful when you use them. Again, from a discursive analytic perspective, it is the language of quantification and persuasion. Numbers become a mode of credibility, a way of transforming complexity and uncertainty into something that is apparent certainty, of making the unthinkable communicable to policymakers and to the public in a way that makes sense. I think his work also illustrates that scientific discourse operates simultaneously as analysis and as narrative, one that can generate both alarm and authority. I think that across this presentation, language operates on 3 levels that are interconnected. Strategically, as scientists and institutions consciously shape terms, categories, and metrics to standardize meaning and mobilize policy. Unconsciously, as inherited metaphors and linguistic habits, that continue to define how we imagine nature, how we imagine science, or maybe how we imagine responsibility. And then psychologically, as Brian says, as he taps into our emotions, our interpretations, our values. So I think from the othering of oceans to the data traps in pollinator studies that Gillian talks about, from categorical frameworks of assessment that Sergio talked about, or quantifying the extinction forecast that Marx talks about, each shows that our environmental understanding is deeply linguistically mediated. So when we examine both the strategic, the unconscious, and the psychological layer of language, we begin to see our assessments not only informs decision, but also shape what is thinkable, what is doable within the policy space. So I think in learning the language of scientific assessment, we might ask not only how to speak it better, but also how to listen differently to the metaphors, to the categories, and also to the silences that Gillian mentions that define the boundaries of our collective imagination. And in that sense, the challenge before us is not only technical, but it's also deeply discursive. To recognize that every assessment is also a story about who we are, about what we value, about how we imagine our place within this world. And I don't know how I'm doing with time, but I don't think I have anything more to say.
Shai, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for bringing that all together. For those of you that have attended some of our webinars in the past, this is the first time that we've had a discussant as part of one of our panels, and I think it's been really useful as a way to bring everyone's presentations together. So thank you. At this time, I would like to open the floor to our audience for questions. So again, if you want to ask a question in the chat, that's one way to do it. Otherwise, feel free to mute yourselves and ask your questions directly. And I guess I am happy to get the ball rolling if folks are a little bit shy for the moment. So my question, kind of speaking to what assessments reflect in terms of what we value and the different perspectives that assessments offer. I wanted to ask of all of our speakers, what are the benefits of coming up or developing multiple types of assessments, right? At least in the US, we have the now canceled National Nature Assessment, but we also have the biodiversity and climate change assessments, which, a lot of folks might think cover the same elements, right? Or include the same type of information, but clearly that's not the case. So what's the benefit of having multiple assessments, even if they might overlap in some ways?
I guess I would jump on that one and say, the one thing that none of us talked about is how long it takes for any of these assessments to actually get done. I think the IPCC is 4 to 5 years. Brian, we were on the NCA for 4 years. So these are big, timely consuming processes. And as you heard recently on the IPCC, that it's become a fire hose. There's so much published in this space that it's gotten, the whole system has gotten itself worse. It's probably teetering. It's probably teetering on the brink of collapse. There's just so much information coming in from different sources, AI, technology, this, that, the other thing, that how we assess it and be timely with that assessment such that policymakers, that's our goal, is, it can inform policymakers, can happen at a crucial moment. It's a huge challenge. So I think the role of many assessments allows that information to move with more flow.
Can I build on that? I think assessments, maybe this isn't fair, it used to be more the voice of God, right? You get a bunch of experts together, they put together the data and it's reality, and you hand down a synthesis of reality. And now, because of all these things we're talking about, we realize that how we, not just how we interpret the data, but the data sources really matter. And so these have moved into this kind of collaborative space where we're really trying to cast a broad net to get traditional and local knowledge is part of this. And so we're never going to get that in one assessment. So I think the different ways that we kind of formulate this, so, the National Climate Assessment had some overlap with the National Nature Assessment, but it was through a different lens and hopefully would have brought in different people to the table. And I think that's really critical, that we keep massaging and refining the way we collect data and the way we report it. And so even if there is overlap, it's casting a broader net to hear those voices and make it more collaborative, is what I'd say.
Thank you. Any of our other speakers want to jump in and add to Jillian and Brian's answers before I move on to our next question? Okay, so
I think they did a great job. I just wanted to make a comment. We're often down on the assessments, but these are almost entirely voluntary, and so I don't think there are necessarily analogs in any other discipline where thousands or tens of thousands of people across the world are donating hundreds of thousands of hours of their time pro bono to get these done. And so it's a massive effort. It takes a lot of time, and we're all doing it, in our free time. So I mean, it's we can't. We should be critical, but we also have to recognize where this has come from. So, but yeah, I'd love to hear the questions from the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that note, Mark. Anna, I think you had your hand up first.
Yeah, hi everybody. First of all, thank you very much to the speakers. Those were really interesting talks. Brian, you were talking about the underview effect and the overview effect. That was really interesting. I'm curious, given that unfortunately we don't have the opportunity ourselves necessarily to go to the space station or go live underwater. I'm curious if there's what your thoughts would be on ways to sort of recreate that kind of effect in the general public or in the people who are making policy decisions.
It's really interesting. And back to, I think it was Mark, it was talking about the kind of danger element. So living under the sea is dangerous. If you come to the surface when you're saturated, you die. And there's a really interesting book written by Rachel Squire called Undersea Geopolitics, where she kind of analyzes the first set of undersea habitats and looks at how similar it is to the space race. And it's all focused on this macho conquering the ocean danger, and makes the really good point that that's not sustainable. That's not going to connect us to the ocean. And so I think it is recognizing that there are different ways to connect to the ocean, and the mystery and the danger is part of that. But recognizing the feedback between humans and non-human organisms is another one. And honestly, I think the way you communicate that is through really effective storytelling, where it is not just taking a scientist down and taking a video of them. It is bringing down storytellers. It is bringing down artists. It is bringing down people who may not have otherwise gotten a chance to live as part of the ecosystem. And that's a huge part of what we're proposing with Proteus. Is even though it would push forward science and technology, it really is aimed at a broad section of society. So even if the total number of people we can get down there is probably small, we want to maximize the diversity of people and viewpoints that are there to share their experiences. So if you get an artist, she's going to tell the story very differently probably than a technologist. And I think that's the way forward, is to try to share those stories in as many different ways and many different perspectives as we can.
Thank you, Anna, for your question, and Brian for the answer. Nick K. Moreno, I know you had a question beforehand, or you had raised your hand. I'm wondering if you're still interested in asking your question. Oh, and Nick K. might have
When you
left.
mentioned,
Oh, no, there you are. Hi.
hi, sorry, yes, my connection's a little wonky. But you have mentioned like the storytelling, and like we want to make science a little bit more accessible, because we tend to use more larger words, and that's
Nick K., I think we might have lost you.
you mentioned, like the terms on the IUCN, the Red List, and etc. But they tend to not go into depth of what these really mean. So how could, like, what is your opinion in terms of the education within college classes on informing what all of these terms mean and how to properly utilize them in any setting, whether it's educational or within the public?
I think that was to Sergio, right?
I think that was to Sergio, but
Yeah.
possibly to the rest of the speakers as well.
Would you mind repeating the question? Not necessarily, Nicholas. Could you summarize it? I had some difficulty picking up all that.
I think the question has to do with how do you approach instructing students in educational settings, right? About the proper use of these terms, so that there's not that mismatch, like you mentioned, in how those terms are used in common parlance versus how they're used in these assessments.
That's a good question. So I struggle, often fail, but keep trying is the answer. The approach we've done, and it's in publications that you can find, is to try to involve students in a hands-on experience of the red listing assessment, which is the one I work most closely with. And so that's one of the approaches, is just having them underwent the process and having someone like myself to answer those questions. The other is, in a way, connected to Gillian's work, which is what she does with students in, let's say, in Yellowstone Park, which is maybe why she has her hand up. So I'll let her complete that thought.
Well, sort of, yeah. And thank you for that question, and the importance of storytelling. And Brian started to answer that as well. But the storytelling is such an important piece of how you tell it. And so one of the stories like pollinators is, you think everybody gets the monarch and they love the monarch, and the monarch becomes this wonderful poster child for everyone running around planting milkweed or planting pollinator gardens. the fact that the monarch is a lousy pollinator from the plant's perspective is something that scientists don't necessarily need to include in the story of the pollinator because you want to protect all the pollinators. So that's that sort of, I think that Shai said about simplifying the data that makes it in language that's approachable without getting into all the complexity, but still generates the benefit at the end. So I think storytelling is a fabulous way. As I said in another report we're all working on, is that the lovely thing about pollinators is that everybody sort of loves them. They think they're all fuzzy and fat and cute like bumblebees, and you can see that from our naturalist data. But the best pollinators out there are probably flies, and they're probably pretty uninteresting. So the bee serves as the storyteller for the pollinator, which we also forget is the plant's perspective on things. So being able to tell that story in a way that the public can see the connection between the plant, the habitat, the pollinator, and agriculture or food or fruit. I'd love to have students say, I know, well, if you're going to celebrate Halloween this year, you need to thank a squash bee because every pumpkin out there is pollinated by a bee. They're an obligate pollinator system. So being able to tell stories so people can connect what they see is an amazing and important point. And I love Shai's point about language, that we need to spend more time and importance about thinking how that language moves in assessments and how the language brings power to what we do. But I see Shai to his camera on, so maybe he can jump in too.
No, I just wanted to say that about how we can teach students, and as Sergio said, we can be the expert that teaches them, or we can use the more psychological, social perspective of knowledge is constructed, and help them construct the knowledge and guide them through the complexity and let them flesh out the complexity, because then they will own it and also understand. If you introduce a tool like discourse analysis in the beginning and tell them, you see that critical tool that think about words, think about who writes them, think why they write them here. Is this a matter of simplification? Is it a matter of power? What is it that happens here? And you let them think about this together and then talk about it. I think I find it very helpful. But once again, I'm a social scientist. I think maybe within the natural scientists there is some other things you need to do in parallel to that as well.
Thank you all for your answers. I know we're a little bit over time, and I want to be respectful of everyone's day. So I'm wondering, are there any last final burning questions from the audience that you would like our speakers to respond to? I'm going to give everyone one more chance. Okay. Well, then I think this is a good place to end. I want to once again thank our speakers and our discussant for giving us a few hours of their day to lead this session. I think it's been a great introduction to our series. Thank you all so much. Thank you to everyone who attended, and I look forward to seeing everyone at our next session.
Thank you.